is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 3MAW. I'm your host, Cole Manbeck, and I'm joined by someone many of you will recognize if you're a hardcore college basketball fan. Evan Miyakawa, one of the most respected college basketball analysts, advanced stats experts out there, joins us on 3MAW today to discuss K-State basketball landing his number 2 ranked player in the entire transfer portal in Illinois transfer, Coleman Hawkins, as well as to discuss K-State's overall transfer portal haul this offseason, a transfer class that he ranks as the second best in the country in terms of overall portal activity. You can find all of Evan's work at evanmiya.com. That's evanmiya.com. There's free content over there that's worth your time checking out. If you like it, for as little as $30 a month, or a year, for as little as $30 a year, you can sign up for much of Evan's advanced numbers. You can also sign up for $5 a month if you want to give it a try. I've done so myself, and I can tell you it is well worth it. Evan's work's been featured on ESPN, CBS Sports, The Athletic, 538, and many other sites. Before we get going with Evan here, a reminder, if you enjoy 3MAW, be sure to subscribe to it on whatever platform you listen or watch it on, including our YouTube channel at KCSNU. Hit that thumbs up like button as well if you're watching on YouTube, and be sure to leave us a review if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. That helps us as we continue to bring you K-State content. And lastly, want to thank our friends at Holiday Distillery. I know many of our listeners were likely enjoying some Holiday Distillery's Ben Holiday Bottled in Bond Bourbon over the weekend as Wildcat fans rejoice K-State wrapping up the portal offseason by landing coveted transfer Coleman Hawkins. So get over to your liquor store, grab some Ben Holiday Bottled in Bond Bourbon or 360 vodka if that's your preference. Great K-State folks who support us on 3MAW. Evan, love your work. Thrilled to have you on the show. Appreciate you joining us. Before we dive in, maybe you could let our listeners know a little about your background, how you got started doing this, and how you came up with some of the formulas around your data.
Sure, yeah. So my background is in stats and sports analytics. But my favorite sport my entire life has been college basketball. I have my PhD in statistics, and so a couple years ago, I created a college basketball analytics website, initially just kind of as a side project, but it's organically grown a lot over the last several years and is now used by a ton of coaches as well as journalists and fans for analyzing the sport, so much so that I was recently able to actually leave my previous job doing consulting for NBA teams to focus full-time on my college basketball website. So you mentioned it, the site, evanmiya.com, covers a lot of things, but it's mainly focused on team and player performance, as well as lineup analysis, transfer portal projections, which is, part of why I'm here today, and other tools used by a lot of coaches for roster building, game scouting, and things of that nature. I know that Jerome Tang and the Kansas State staff regularly uses my website. I've had conversations with them about players that they're looking at in the portal using my database tools. So, definitely a fun time to be talking about what they're doing in the portal for sure. But, it's used by a lot of people in a lot of different ways.
You have a metric called BPR that you've created that you use to rank players. And can you explain maybe what it is and what goes into it at a high level?
Sure. So Bayesian Performance Rating, or BPR for short, basically is what I consider to be the best all-in-one sort of all-encompassing metric for evaluating how impactful or valuable a player is while they're on a court on a per-possession basis. So basically, there's an offensive BPR, a defensive BPR, and then you add those up. And basically what it's telling you is when this player is on the floor, kind of regardless of everything else, are they increasing their team's performance and ultimately their chances of winning? And so it counts for a couple different things. It looks at your individual box stats, like how efficient you are, how much you contribute to your team's success through those individual measures, but it also looks at just your impact on overall team performance. So, when a player is on the floor at the end of the day, whether they score 30 points per game or 5 points per game, if while the player's on the floor, they're dramatically increasing their team's their team's level of play, like that's ultimately the player that you want on the floor. So BPR also looks at some of these advanced metrics that are based around sort of like on-off splits and things like that. Basically looking at when you're on the floor, are you increasing your team's success? And it adjusts for the quality of all of their players that are on the court with you while you're playing. So, for example, if your coach puts you in to always guard the other team's star player, you would get credit for that on the defensive end, things like that. There's a little bit of historical information baked in there as well. Like if a player is a really highly regarded high school recruit and they're still relatively young in their college career, it also bakes some of that into it as well, because it's ultimately a metric that is not just reflective of how you've performed previously, but also saying predictively going forward, how good of a player are you going to be? And so when we talk about the transfer portal, basically what I'm doing here is I have a transfer projection for every single player in the portal that basically says, regardless of what team or what context they're playing in, if we sort of adjust for all of those factors, how good is this player going to be on offense and defense for any team that they could play for next season? And that's ultimately how I rank all the players in the portal. And then on top of that, build, transfer class rankings, for example, that looks at the accumulation of talent that a team gets through the portal.
You already hit on some of what we'll hit on and expand on a little bit later, but that brings us to Coleman Hawkins, Evan, which you have ranked as your number 2 transfer to enter the portal this entire offseason, had the 17th best BPR in all of college basketball last season. You tweeted this when Hawkins committed last week. His box BPR was top 20 in the country as he had good per game stats, 12.6 rebounds, 2.7 assists, 1.5 steals, 1.1 blocks, while improving his shooting a lot from last season, hitting 37% of his threes and 79% from the foul line. Perhaps most importantly, his play elevated an Illinois performance to a different level. He led the team and adjusted team efficiency margin, outscoring opponents by 32 points per 100 possessions, and his offensive on-off splits are fantastic, 15 PP 100 better when he was on the floor versus on the bench, pointing to how critical he was to Illinois' offensive attack, which, by the way, was a tremendous Illinois team that went to the Elite Eight and won 29 games and had an All-American type player in Terrence Shannon. And Coleman Hawkins ranks ahead of Shannon even in the BPR. What is it about Hawkins' game that stands out, and why is his BPR so high? I know I just outlined some of it, Evan.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, some people might ask why a guy who only averaged 12 and 6 is ranked as the second best player in the portal behind Kadari Richmond, who transferred from Seton Hall to St. John's. The thing that I like about Coleman Hawkins is that, he kind of has played a secondary role at Illinois, behind Terrence Shannon the last 2 seasons. But in that role, he's kind of done everything that they needed him to do. He's been a really reliable scorer. He's a playmaker. He also, has contributed defensively as well. For a guy who can stretch the floor and also attack the rim, hitting 37% of his threes in the Big Ten is no joke. And so the floor spacing that he brings and the dynamism to be able to play either the 5 or the 4 for pretty much anyone is a big deal. And you mentioned this as well. The other thing that I've loved about Coleman Hawkins, not just last season, but the season prior, is basically when you looked at how Illinois performed while Hawkins was on the floor versus when he was on the bench, there was a night and day difference in terms of their offensive efficiency. And basically what that points to is that even if Coleman Hawkins wasn't the leading scorer for the team, his presence on the floor, the things that he was doing, the way that the opponents were having to guard him, and the threat that he provided both through a scoring and playmaking role really just elevated their attack and points to the fact that whether he had returned for Illinois this season or is switching systems and is at Kansas State, that he is just going to elevate any offense that he's a part of, whether he's the primary scorer or secondary scorer. And I certainly think in this context, with the other pieces that are going to be around him at Kansas State, he could be the number 1 option, but a lot of times he might be the number 2 or number 3 option, but that's really where he excels. He does not need to be scoring 20 points per game in order to have a big impact on the offense. And the other thing too is that, people were, he can sometimes be a bit of a polarizing player, both through his, personality. Some people have pointed to the fact that defensively, he was somewhat of a liability, and certainly some of the advanced metrics point to that as well. Illinois' defense wasn't the greatest when he was on the floor last year. But when you look at both his individual defensive contributions, so, he averaged 1.5 steals and over a block per game at Illinois, while being mostly just an offensive player. That was really his role in this team. Along with the fact that Jerome Tang has experience, being able to convert players into really sound defensive guys, both at Baylor and at Kansas State. I'm not super worried about it, and I certainly think Coleman Hawkins' offensive potential far outweighs his defensive liability. And so when you sort of combine those two elements of his game, it adds up to him still being one of the best players in the portal, not just from a star power perspective or an NIL making perspective, but just in terms of the actual statistical value that he's going to bring on the floor to Kansas State.
Yeah, it's interesting, Evan, when I look at Coleman Hawkins' numbers, I think one of the things stand out is here's a guy that played stretch 4, stretch 5 for Illinois, but the fact that he not only can score, he can rebound it a little bit, but he gets out in passing lanes. He had a steal rate of 2.6, which I believe was top 30 in the Big Ten. He had a block rate of 3.0, which I believe was top 30 in the Big Ten. And then you got to talk about assist rate, of nearly 15. And he had an assist rate of 17.3, which is top 25 as a junior in the Big Ten Conference. He just seems like a guy that stats or stuffs the stat sheet in a lot of different ways. He impacts winning, not just with scoring the basketball, but kind of a unicorn per se in terms of his ability at his height and size to do all the various things that he does do on the court.
I agree. And I think, the most attractive thing about any player in this day and age, especially in the portal, is what is your points per game? And so a lot of the most coveted players in the portal have been guys who are 15 plus points per game guys, even if they're coming from schools that are lower mid-major level. But I think that, when you look at a guy who is going to be a valuable add to your team, the scoring is important, and Coleman Hawkins has that. But he also has the ability to do everything else that you need. He can facilitate. He can play a lot of different roles in the offense. He can allow you to scheme up a lot of different schemes with the types of lineups that you can roll out because of how versatile a player he is. And he's athletic enough, and I think when he's focused, he's going to be defensively strong enough to, not be a weakness on that side of the court either. And so, like I said, I think he's a really balanced player. I think he's a great fit for this team because Jerome Tang and the coaching staff can really use him in a lot of different ways. And I'm really excited to see what they do with him, to be honest.
What about his 3-point shooting this year? Evan jumps to 37%, but it's on a large volume. 160 attempts. His first 3 years, 59 of 210, was 28% from three. And I think a lot of people will look at that and say, this year's the outlier. Is it more fluky than anything? The fact that he shot 37% from three, which was 17th best in the Big Ten out of guys that attempted 100 attempts or more from beyond the arc. But to me, when you look at his form, when you look at his release, everything looks consistent. It looks like a shot that should have been better than it was in terms of the percentages his first 3 years. And the fact that he did it on 160 attempts, and a lot of his shots, if you look at the analytics, were farther behind just the college three-point line to farther space the floor this year, seems like a guy where the numbers from this year are maybe more in line with where he will go moving forward from shooting the basketball.
I would agree. Certainly any time that you have the most recent season is the most important when you're looking at these kinds of things. But you had mentioned it, every season before he'd shot under 30% from three. So maybe he won't shoot 37%, but if I had to put a guess on it, I would say, the 34, 35% mark is kind of where the truth is for him, especially at that volume, which is a great volume for a player of his size. Shooting close to 5 attempts from three per game and making 37% is that's a massive add to your offense. It adds a lot of dynamism and really makes you kind of unguardable on any part of the court. So even if that drops a little bit, the threat he still provides from three is still a big dimension to his game for sure.
It's interesting you bring up his defense because there are mixed reviews there. I've read a lot of reports that just love his versatility on the defensive end, right? His ability to switch to guard 1 through 5, that he's able to do that. Now he can get beat off the ball on occasion at his size, but he's a really smart defender. Like we already talked about his steal rate and everything. I'm curious, as you think about him in Kansas State's roster, I think he may play some three, right? And most of the time at Illinois, he played a stretch 4, stretch 5. If he's playing the three at K-State, and again, I'm sure he'll play some 4 and 5. They built a roster, Jerome Tang and staff, that's very versatile, positionless for the most part. But how do you think his game would translate to playing small forward or playing out on the wing at the three?
I think for a guy of his size, he's got the talent and the skill set and the athletic ability to be able to guard the three. He hasn't done a lot of it yet, so, there's still kind of TBD as to whether it will work. I can't conclusively say one way or the other. But, I think he's got the skill set to do it. So I think you should definitely try it, because if you can get Coleman Hawkins to give you valuable minutes at the three, even in small spurts, that gives you a massive leg over the opponent when they don't have that level of versatility and they have to just sub a guy who's playing the 4 or 5 out instead of having him shift to the three for a few minutes. So, we don't know if it'll work or not, but I think he definitely has on paper what it takes to potentially be good in that role. So I certainly think it's worth a shot.
Well, as always, going to tell you about our friends over at Home Field Apparel. Get on over to homefieldapparel.com and check out all of the great K-State gear, retro, sleek t-shirts, hoodies, K-State hats, a K-State shooting shirt that John Kurtz on 3-Maw can't wait to get his hands on as well. Those retro hats that they have, I think they got 3 of them on their website. I'm rocking a retro Copper Bowl shirt. If you can see it on the screen, I might have to adjust, but 1993 Copper Bowl shirt. from Home Field Apparel. This is the long sleeve version of it. I've also got a white Copper Bowl t-shirt in my closet as well from the 1993 Weiserlock Copper Bowl over Wyoming that Kansas State dominated. Tons of retro stuff, a Big 8 champ shirt from 1977, etc. Just as an example of some of the awesome retro gear that they have over at homefieldapparel.com. So go get stocked up with it. Enter discount code 3MAW23 when you go to checkout. Again, that's promo code 3MAW23, and you will get 15% off your entire order, no matter how much you buy. So 15% off with discount code 3MAW23. Go check them out, homefieldapparel.com.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
When you look at K-State's overall roster composition, Evan, I just talked about, they've kind of built a roster that can be pretty positionless, like Ashore, a guy that you have in the top 100 of your overall transfer portal rankings, transferring in from Samford, is a guy who can shoot it a little bit from three as well. Smaller sample size, but 27 to 62 from three this last year. So he can maybe space the floor a little bit when he's playing down in the paint. You talk about 6-7 guys on this team that have shot nearly 37% or better from three last year. What do you make of the overall roster composition that Jerome Tang and staff have assembled this offseason?
So high level, here's what I love about what Kansas State has done. As I mentioned before, I have transfer class rankings, which there's two different things I look at. One is your incoming transfer class. So sort of similar to how you'll see freshman high school recruiting rankings for a certain year and saying, like, how good is your class? I do a similar thing for transfers that looks at both how good are the players you're bringing in, also just what's the quantity of those players. 5 good players is better than 1 good player. So in terms of incoming transfer class ranking, Kansas State is 3rd in the entire country, which is amazing. The other factor to this, too, is I also have an overall transfer activity ranking, which basically says how good are your transfer additions minus your transfer departures? Or in other words, how much better did your team get this offseason through the portal? And so there are some teams who can have a good transfer class, but they still lose a lot to the portal, and so their overall transfer activity ranking isn't that good. Kansas State ranked 2nd in the country in that. So not only is their transfer class good, but they've not lost pieces that are anywhere near equivalent in value to what they've gained through the portal. And so they've dramatically increased the level of talent on their roster through the portal. And, you mentioned a lot of the common traits that you'll see is good three-point shooting. It's a trait I've seen kind of across a lot of the best transfer classes this offseason, where one of the most consistent traits that's sought out is players who can stretch the floor and be a threat from three. And so if you roll out a lineup where you have, say, 3-4 guys who are comfortable shooting, mid to high 30% from three, that's a big difference than if you just have 1 or 2 guys that the opponent has to really key in on from deep, and then otherwise they don't really have to worry about 3-point threats. And so especially when you have so many moving pieces in the transfer portal, and this team is largely comprised of new transfers, new faces, being able to just guarantee, hey, when we roll out our lineups, a majority of these players are going to be a threat from distance. That's a big factor, and I really like what they've done in that regard.
It seems like shooting, Evan, and then length, right? So they've got a unique roster in the fact that 11 of the 13 scholarship guys are 6'4" or longer. They've got the length and the paint. Some people will be like, they seem a little heavy in the front court in terms of overall scholarship allocation. But when you look at the ability of these guys to shoot the basketball, it seems like a great combination to me in the modern day basketball of what you might be looking for.
I agree. And like I said, in the transfer portal, with the fact that you often are in situations where you're recruiting guys sort of to fill up a majority of your roster spots, which is what Kansas State did this last offseason. They wanted to upgrade on last season, and so there's only really like 2 meaningful returners on this team, and the rest are comprised of transfers. We'll likely see a starting lineup that's entirely comprised of transfers. 3-point shooting and athleticism and length are 2 of the things that are relatively easy to quantify in guys that you're looking at in the portal. This offseason, there were over 2,000 players in the portal, and, there's a limited amount of time to make moves on these guys, especially if they're wanting to move quickly. And so, those are some of the easiest traits to identify. And so if you can guarantee that, your team is going to be comprised of guys who, for the most part, can stretch the floor and are going to be, tall and have, big wingspans and, be able to move around the court and keep up with anyone in the Big 12, you can kind of work out the rest of the details there. So I definitely think it's smart to approach it in that way, and certainly Jerome Tang has done that.
Doug McDaniel, the very first guy that Kansas State landed out of the portal. I know when you initially did your transfer portal rankings at the onset of portal season, Doug McDaniel, I want to say, was in your top 5 at one point and one of the most coveted transfers. Now, I think he concluded right around 23 in the top 25 of your portal rankings, but obviously he was the priority get for Jerome Tang and staff to get that point guard right out of the gate, a really good point guard. What do you like about Doug McDaniel?
Yeah, I mean, he was one of the earliest big names in the portal. I think I had him number 1 when I first released my portal rankings, because he was one of the earliest names in the portal. And I really, really like Doug McDaniel. I think he fits exactly the kind of point guard that Jerome Tang has excelled with the last several seasons. He started out his season really hot before Michigan's kind of entire team slumped in the latter part of the season. And his stat line that he put up was still really good. He averaged 16 points per game. He was close to 5 assists per game, and 4 boards too for a guy who's 4 boards per game for a guy who's under 6 foot is great. A great 3-point shooting threat, again, which is something you love to see in your playmaking point guard. 37% from 3 on almost 6 attempts per game. That's a lot of volume. And so between his encouraging offensive stats that he's had, and also he still has another level to reach. He was a 4-star recruit out of high school. And so that's actually one of the factors that my model takes into account when looking at his potential is, especially for guys who are not, haven't played 3 years in college, for example, is there your high school recruiting profile can often point to some unreached potential. And so he certainly still has that. And so that's part of why he's received such a high grade. I think he's a great fit. I think he's electric, and he fits the perfect mold for a Jerome Tang point guard.
In the era of the transfer portal, and you've kind of hit on this already, Evan, at some detail here, but you see a lot of guys that are highly coveted in the portal that put up big numbers at low major, mid-major schools, and there's some of the higher ranked transfers that are in the portal, some of the most sought after. Hey, you look at Kansas State, right? Ashore transferring from Samford, 16 points, 6 rebounds a game with Samford, obviously had the big NCAA tournament game against Kansas, which gives you some encouragement there. You look at a Max Jones transferred from Cal State Fullerton. You look at CJ Jones transferring from Illinois Chicago, transferring up to one of the toughest, if not the toughest conference in America in the Big 12. How do you adjust for that when you're projecting out in your model of the impact these guys are going to have and how it translates from a low major, mid major to a power league?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the level of competition that you played is a big factor in your transfer projection because, 15 points per game at a, Cal State Fullerton is not the same as 15 points per game at a, Baylor, for example. And so, there is a sort of level of translation of saying, what was the level of competition that this player played against? How good was the team that he was playing on overall? Those are important factors because they often lead to better predictions of player success than just looking at a player's stat line without any other context. So one of the things that ends up being an important factor in especially a player's offensive projection on my website is not if you're a good scorer, what are the other ways that you contribute to your team's success? And so if you are a player from a lower mid-major who maybe wasn't on a team that wasn't that great or played in a conference that wasn't that great, if you scored a lot of points but otherwise didn't really contribute much to your team's performance outside of that, like you didn't play make much, you didn't rebound much, you weren't great defensively in the different ways that I grazed that out, that can really kind of hurt your overall transfer offensive projection because a lot of times scoring, from a low major to jumping to a high major, it may or may not translate to the same way. Whereas if you have a guy who demonstrates that he can score but also provide value in other ways, those players often do a lot better. So, for example, Ashore, as you mentioned, he was a great scorer at Sanford, but he also averaged 6 rebounds per game, almost 2 blocks per game. He was incredibly efficient from the field. He shot over 62% from 2-point range and was in the mid-40s from 3 on almost 2 attempts per game. Like, all of those are good signs that he's going to be able to translate, and even if he won't be able to replicate those stats, he likely won't, he's still going to be good enough to play at the Big Ten level. And that's why I kind of give him like an A- grade offensively. You compare that to a player like Max Jones, who I think is going to be an important player for this team, But basically, he averaged 15 points per game at Cal State Fullerton. But other than that, he didn't really do as much. And he also turned the ball over a lot. And so when you look at those factors and the fact that he wasn't very efficient from 2-point range, he shot under 40%, and his 3-point shooting was good. But like, there's not that many other signs outside of just volume scoring and shooting the 3-ball well that really point to him having success in the Big 12, which is why he's a notch below some of those other guys in terms of his transfer projection.
As a golfer for years, I've been hearing PXG say nobody makes golf clubs like they do, period. Know what? They're right. I went in for a fitting and saw for myself. I went in and swung the PXG Black Ops driver. Total game changer. No longer have to sacrifice distance for forgiveness. No matter how good the tools, getting fitted can take your game to a whole new level, and they'll even give you a dozen golf balls free just for doing it. The world-class team of PXG experts will analyze every aspect of your swing with every club and give you feedback in real time on how to improve. I got to experience it firsthand. Went in for a fitting in May, got the custom tools that they gave me, everything that I needed, swung a bunch of their irons, then swung the Black Ops driver from PXG, hit over 100 golf balls, read all the analytics, got all that received immediately as I was going through it. Every ball I hit, I could see on the map in front of me where my shot was going, the angle of my shot. If I actually hit it straight, you could tell the distance over there on the TrackMan Analytics computer screen monitor that would show you how far it went, the loft, the elevation, the velocity that you hit the ball, etc. All the data that you could want. And then you got your swing coach that is sitting there that is making adjustments to customize the club, to adjust the shaft or the weight distribution of the driver head, etc., to make sure that it fits exactly your type of swing and customizes it unique to you. So go check them out. It was a first-class experience, tremendous customer service, great setup over there at PXG. Go support them and check out all the great work they do, especially if you're a serious golfer, or even if you're just a recreational golfer like me. Go in and get fitted. It is well worth your time. PXG made me a believer. They'll do the same for every golfer in Kansas City. Visit pxg.com/3mall to schedule your fitting at PXG Kansas City, located at 7517 West 119th Street in Overland Park. Get fitted for any club and you'll get a dozen golf balls free. That's pxg.com/3mall to schedule your fitting, pxg.com/3mall. Limit 1 dozen golf balls per person. Promotion ends June 30th. Other terms and conditions may apply. See store for details.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
I assume you also have to think about their role, right, and the new system that they're going into. So as I think about a Max Jones, Evan, at Cal State Fullerton, his first year there, he played more off the ball. They actually had, it was Reitzel, I think, that went to Alabama, obviously lit it up, but Reitzel played primarily the point, if I recall correctly, for Cal State Fullerton. And Max Jones' first year there, he played more off the ball, and his efficiency numbers were higher. And as I think about like a Max Jones at K-State, he probably won't play the point, that, and he'll probably play more off ball where his numbers were better in his first year at Fullerton. How do you adjust for that? Or is that something that you are even able to take into consideration? I know that's hard.
Yeah. I mean, it's a guessing game to say what a player's role will be if they haven't already committed to a team. And then once a player commits to a team, I'm not going back in and like adjusting their transfer projection based on what their role will be, because even if we can guess at it, we don't actually totally know. So that's not really something that I'm able to do, unfortunately. And so that is, however, one factor that, coaching staffs can do is, saying, like, for example, I had the Louisville staff reached out to me a couple weeks ago because they got a guy, Kayshawn Pryor from South Florida, who was a big transfer name. He didn't have that great of an offensive grade on my website, but part of that was because he takes a lot of mid-range shots and he doesn't shoot them that well. And so they were wondering, hey, if we fixed his mid-range shot, or if we removed that from his statistical profile, how would that change his transfer outlook? And the reason for that is because they might encourage him to take different types of shots than what he took at South Florida. And so that can change the outlook of a player if you remove, parts of their game that are bad, or that you're not going to use him in that way. And so, that's not something that I can account for in my sort of public transfer rankings. So you don't really know exactly how a team is planning on using a player.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. A lot of this projection, it would be very challenging to do as a result of that. Overall Big 12 picture, right? You already mentioned it. K-State, number 2 overall transfer activity ranking. They've shot up. They're number 1 in the Big 12, which, has been the best conference in America for a while now. Baylor, number 11. KU, number 10. Texas Tech, 15. West Virginia, 16. Cincinnati, 23. Iowa State, 22. So you got 7 teams overall transfer activity ranking in your top 25 overall. How do you kind of assess the landscape? Who did the best jobs there? I felt like at one point, everybody was just mesmerized with what KU was doing in the portal with AJ Storr and Rylan Griffin and Zeke Mayo, et cetera. But how do you kind of handicap what the Big 12 has done this offseason?
Yeah, I mean, certainly before the commitment of Coleman Hawkins, Kansas would have had the slight edge over Baylor in terms of their overall transfer activity. At one point, Kansas also had Riley Kugel from Florida, who ended up decommitting and going elsewhere, I think to Mississippi State. And, so a lot of people at that point, before he decommitted, had Kansas as definitely the number 1 sort of transfer activity. I've never been quite as high on Kansas because I had sort of mentioned this before, like a lot of the players that they brought in, like a Zeke Mayo, for example, great scorer, but analytically outside of that, there's not as many characteristics that point to him being as good as people might think he will be. And certainly he could surprise. Like I wouldn't be, he could be one of the best players in the Big 12 for all I know. So I've always had their transfer class a little bit lower than everyone else, but still like top 10 right now. Just in general, the Big 12 has been extremely impressive this offseason. I mean, you mentioned it. There's 8 teams in the top 40 in the entire country in terms of overall transfer activity. And it's looking like, when we have our preseason poll out and, different people are putting their top 25s together, there's a lot of Big 12 teams that are kind of in that top 10 conversation. And so I think that the top half of the Big 12 is going to be absolutely loaded this year. So I think there's an argument to be made that this might be one of the strongest years the Big 12 has ever had in terms of especially like the quality of teams that are going to get into the tournament.
So you're still thinking toughest league in America based off what?
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they've been the toughest league for the last several years. I think it will continue to be the case. The additions, sort of inflating the sizes of leagues can certainly change that conversation a little bit. But every conference is adding teams, not just the Big 12. And the Big 12's auditions last offseason ended up being really great. BYU, Houston, Cincinnati, like they all had much better seasons than people were expecting. So I think the Big 12 has done well with their expansion. And I don't think that like losing Texas and Oklahoma is going to hurt them as much as people might have thought a couple years ago.
Yeah, obviously adding Arizona, who's been a traditional power in the basketball landscape. Colorado was a good tournament team last year as well. But the only reason I asked you that is because when I looked at the overall transfer activity rankings, while there were so many teams in that top 25, top 40, there were also 7 teams that were 300 or lower. And I got to tell you, Evan, the one that surprised me, and again, I haven't done a deep dive on this, but seeing Arizona at 356, right? Like that was kind of a shock to the system just because of, what we've known to become with that program and what they do. So I just had wondered what you thought about the depth of the league and if you thought those maybe newcomers coming to the league would be right there to challenge in this first year like in Arizona.
Yeah, I think the trouble with Arizona in terms of their overall transfer activity ranking is that Umar Ballo is one of my top-rated players in the portal, and he left. And that carries a ton of weight for that. So if you are already resigned to the fact that you've sort of mutually agreed that Ballo's leaving, there's not much you can do about that. And so in that sense, if you kind of take Umar Ballo leaving out of the equation here, like Tobe Waka from Tennessee, I think he's a really great transfer addition. And they've got a couple other players who could be really good for them. But you lose Umar Ballo, you lose Kylan Boswell to Illinois. Those two players, were really important last year. Boswell was a little bit disappointing compared to what the expectation was for him, but I still think he's a really good player. So, in just on paper, they lost a lot more than they gained just in terms of the strength of those players. There may not be anything that they can do about that. And I still think they're going to be a really good team next year.
I just want to circle back with a couple more questions. We'll get you out of here, Evan. You've been more than generous with your time. I appreciate you a great deal. But, as I think about you just brought up maybe top 25 rankings going into the season. You look at K-State's roster, and we talked about their transfer portal ranking, their transfer activity ranking this offseason. What type of talent do you see here? Is this a top 25 talent composition? Is it top 15? Like, what do you think the ceiling is, or where do you think they might fall when you look at them?
I think the range of outcomes for this team is ginormous. I think this team could be top 15. I think this team could miss the tournament. I really do think that there's just a large spectrum here, which is kind of what makes them one of the most fun teams to watch this offseason. One of the most interesting things this offseason in particular is the number of teams who have mostly had to completely rehaul their roster through the transfer portal. Kansas State is one of those. It's not quite as extreme for them as you'll see for like a Louisville or a Kentucky, for example, who basically is returning nobody and had to get a new coach and recruit an entire roster in just a matter of weeks. But on paper, like Kansas State is going to be one of the most reliant teams in the nation on incoming transfers. And that's part of what's allowed them to raise their talent level. But with that also comes the challenge of ingratiating all of those pieces. I recently did a study that I'm actually probably publishing tomorrow on basically in the modern portal era, what is the best way to construct rosters? Because there's a lot of different ways. It's not just through traditional high school recruiting anymore. You can recruit through the portal, you can recruit through high school, you can be like a Marquette and just keep all of your players every offseason and really go that way. And so there's a lot of different avenues for it. And basically kind of one of the results of the study, besides the fact that just getting better talent is good, you should always pursue better players, kind of regardless of where they come from. But one of the challenges is that if you have a team comprised of almost no returning players, those teams often struggle more than the teams that can have maybe at least 50% of their minutes come from players who are returning. And so that's going to be a challenge for Kansas State to overcome this season. Now, there have been teams who have been successful with that, but we're going to have way more teams in this category this year than we've had in previous years who are kind of going to be almost entirely transfer reliant or entirely reliant on new players. So in that sense, I think it's likely to say that the talent on this roster might be slightly ahead of where I might actually predict this team to finish the season, just because that's going to be a hurdle that they're going to have to cross that other teams won't. But as I said, I think the range of outcomes is really large for this team, and they could be, top 3 in the Big 12, or they could struggle. So it kind of depends.
Yeah, I had wondered how important continuity is and like what that right balance is, if there's a middle ground that you need to be at. Of course, you look at what Kansas State did a couple years ago in Jerome Tang's first year with replacing the entire roster outside of Marquise Noel and Ish Massoud, 11 new guys. They were able to get it to gel. So we'll see if they're able to do it again. One more quick question. What are your thoughts on Ugonna Onienzo, Kentucky transfer big man? I mean, this is a guy, Evan, that you mentioned recruiting rankings playing a part, was a top 30 consensus recruit out of high school, showed some flashes last year at Kentucky, tremendous shot blocking ability. What do you think his ceiling is, or like where do the metrics say about his potential and where he might go?
You talk about Coleman Hawkins being a unicorn. I think Onienzo is potentially a unicorn light in the sense that, he played, a reasonable role at Kentucky in his freshman season. Obviously, they had a lot of pieces to deal with. But in under 20 minutes per game, he averaged almost 3 blocks a game, which is insane. So that is a really great sign that his rim protection ability might be key for this team. And you mentioned it as well. He was a really highly regarded recruit out of high school. He's just played 1 season. And a lot of players in the past who have been highly regarded high school recruits and have had a decent to underwhelming freshman season often really pop in their sophomore year. So there's a lot of potential there for him. And that's part of why I think he has a pretty reasonable transfer grade that it suggests that he's going to be much better than he was last year. And last year's stats were really encouraging. So whether he starts or comes off the bench, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what he does. I'm really glad that Jerome Tang got him, because I think you almost have to take a swing at a guy like this, because he could be a really dominant player down low for them.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch him, excited to see where his ceiling can potentially take him and the right fit and getting maybe some more minutes there, and cannot wait to watch all of the talent that Kansas State has unfolded. If Jerome Tang and staff can get them to gel, like you mentioned, and get the cohesion factor up, Evan, it certainly seems like a team that can make a deep run in March if it all comes together. A lot of talent in Manhattan. You've got him as the 2nd overall, best transfer portal activity ranking, and we appreciate the heck out of you, Evan, for jumping on with us and talking some K-State basketball, Big 12, and everything. Get over to evanmiya.com. Again, that's EVANMIYA.com. go check out all the great work that Evan does over there. And Evan, we appreciate you for coming on the show and appreciate all of you for listening to another episode of 3 Mo.